But yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to talk about a subject that, as you say, is really controversial, certainly in the historical context, and I think certainly remains so to this day, and something that's really been a kind of key defining interest of my kind of both kind of professional and personal life in many senses. Um, just broadly, I think alcohol related issues are, a large part of our culture and our discussion, and, feature heavily in media coverage. And, as you said, Melissa's here, and on the last podcast, we discussed about the kind of need to have a kind of alcohol related identity in terms of certainly in social situations that people want to know what your position is. Do you drink or don't you drink? And in that sense, there's a whole set of expectancies and social norms around that. And yeah, from the kind of personal perspective, I got interested in the subject, of alcohol more broadly, having attended kind of university as an undergraduate in the late 90s, and developing an alcohol-related problems during that time. Well, actually, they probably started more from the moment I started drinking at about 14 on a regular basis. But kind of culminating around sort of my early 20s, that led to, alcohol-related problems, certainly physical-related problems, as well as various incidents that, some of which I'd be too embarrassed or ashamed to probably share in a public platform, but certainly regrets as a result of very intoxicated drinking occasions, and certainly catastrophic hangovers. So yeah, after kind of stopping drinking, after having failed to moderate my alcohol use for probably about a year during my kind of second year as an undergraduate. This was all down in Brighton. I did a history degree at Sussex University. But yeah, following the kind of wake-up call of physical health problems, I kind of struggled to moderate my alcohol use for about a year, and before kind of finally giving up alcohol altogether for about 8 years. And during that time, I graduated. I started working for a local authority where I kind of managed to wing my way into a job which was kind of about crime reduction, including violent and alcohol-related crime, which, could almost say I had sort of some lived experience, having, certainly been in a lot of heavily intoxicated environments and drinking occasions some years prior as a student. But from there, I actually got much more interested in the kind of public health and the prevention side of things. And also simultaneously, after 8 years of not drinking, I, had become aware of the kind of ideas and the controversies around controlled drinking. And, probably for about a good 4 years, I was really contemplating, the question of whether I would be able to drink again. And I think it's probably important to say that when I stopped drinking, I'd never said definitively, I'll never drink again. I just felt at the time that it was difficult to control my alcohol use, and that was problematic. And that not drinking at all was an easier kind of option. In fact, it just was the option. If you have an alcohol problem, then not drinking is, I think, just the assumed response to that. So yeah, about sort of in my late 20s, after having not drunk for about 8 years, I did begin this kind of experiment of moderating my drinking. And as I said, having done quite a lot of research and thinking and discussion with kind of notable people in the field about it. And I still had a lot of apprehension about doing so. But I think one of the things that I was very clear about was that if I failed and it became evident that my drinking was becoming problematic again, that I felt that I could be happy in returning to being a non-drinker again, that was something I was very prepared to do. And I was quite clear about what controlled drinking looked like and what a problem might look like. And I think probably the thing that concerned me most was just the psychological cravings that I experienced, previously, where I was just kind of, always thinking about alcohol, always wanting to drink and to begin a drinking occasion. And that was, and obviously after 8 years of not drinking, I'd kind of moved on from that. I got to a point where I no longer thought about drinking. In fact, it was probably a year of not drinking, perhaps even a bit less, where it felt like I'd moved on to a place where alcohol wasn't imposing on my thoughts in such a way that I felt like, it was a bit of a struggle in that sense. Of course, there was a struggle in terms of, social pressures and expectations as kind of a person, in your 20s to not drink, and we all know about the kind of stigma of being a non-drinker as well as a kind of problem drinker. So yeah, like that was kind of the main concern, that would drinking again return me to this place of wanting to drink all the time and wanting to do so kind of problematically. So very tentatively, I began drinking, very small amounts of alcohol on a very kind of infrequent basis. And I suppose when I say very small amounts, I mean essentially within the recommended guidelines, and drinking not more than 2 or 3 days per week. At that time, it was daily guidelines. We now kind of have the 14-unit weekly threshold again since 2016. But I'll kind of come on to the evidence bit and sort of put my own sort of story into the context of how I make sense of controlled drinking and who and why and when it might be appropriate and when not, into that kind of broader evidence that's kind of out there. But essentially, I think the main thing that was really important for me that I haven't mentioned so far was that during that period of non-drinking, I also did quite a lot of psychotherapy. And for me, when I look back on my problematic drinking, those kind of years of very heavy binge drinking, that led to physical health problems and, as I said, these kind of cravings and this constant desire to want to drink. I think what was underlying that was, what in sort of American literature might be called negative emotionality, or in kind of more European literature, negative affect regulation. So high levels of anxiety are very predictive of problematic drinking. And I think, alcohol was firstly an instant way to kind of cancel what was at the time quite palpable levels of anxiety, although I don't really think I really realised that, because that just seemed normal to me, and I hadn't really gone through a process of recognising that, as well as kind of, I think, other related manifestations of kind of psychological issues I hadn't really addressed with. So I did have a lot of kind of sort of anger and things that something I still carry to this day is a really strong, I get quite distressed, to use quite a strong word, about things that I perceive as unfair. And I think certainly in those early years, I really would struggle when something I perceived as unfair, that would create a very kind of difficult emotional experience to contain. So alcohol kind of felt like a coping mechanism, or a kind of release valve for dealing with what I felt were, what I think looking back were kind of psychological issues. So of course, I stuck with 6 years of psychotherapy because I think that it really helped me address those underlying issues, and in turn removed the kind of drive of the driver for kind of destructive or problematic drinking. So I suppose what I'm really saying is that, for me, I have a psychologically orientated view of alcohol problems, in the sense that I think alcohol problems are often, or very often, just a coping mechanism with problems that we experience in life and our emotions and so on. And much in the same way that I would look at most mental health problems as just kind of common ways of coping or responding, or normal reactions, if you like, to the stresses and experiences that we've had as kind of humans. Um, so for me, to kind of try and narrow down when I think controlled drinking is possible after having a problematic relationship, my very strong kind of sense and personal experience is that it becomes possible when you are no longer having a strong desire to drink to maybe manage other issues. So I think, you know, you know, using alcohol in a kind of non-problematic way means alcohol plays a kind of quite limited role. You're not really looking for intoxication. You might just have a few drinks to complement a wine or complement a meal or a social occasion. But it's not fulfilling or trying to fill a big gap or provide a big set of meanings in your life. And I think that's how I kind of conceptualize it. And if we think about kind of the process of recovery, I think that marries up in the sense that what we know works about recovery and alcohol treatment is a process of, kind of reevaluating and reappraising lots of different things rather than just the substance itself, but being able to, so a lot of people talk about recovery capital, meaning and structure in our life as being really important things that kind of allow us to find, more positive kind of meaning and value in our life that we might have been trying to avoid or deal with through the use of kind of drugs or alcohol. So I'll just kind of perhaps try and wrap it up a bit more with a bit about the kind of broader contextual evidence base. We know that there's been a long history and controversy around kind of controlled drinking outcomes for dependent drinkers, and various attempts to kind of reject or even smear kind of evidence around controlled drinking controlled drinking outcomes. So most famously, the kind of Sobels and the kind of challenge to their controlled drinking research kind of throughout the 70s mostly. But earlier this year, in fact, there was a meta-analysis that included about 26 or 24 different studies on controlled versus abstinent outcomes in treatment. And the conclusion of that meta-analysis and systematic reviews was that controlled drinking outcomes are not inferior to abstinence-orientated outcomes. And what was quite surprising in that as well was that conventional wisdom suggests that severity of alcohol dependence is a really key factor in this. So the more severe an alcohol problem, the more complex and long established and kind of chronic, if you like, this alcohol problem has become, the less suitable a controlled drinking outcome would be. And that's kind of conventional wisdom. But that meta-analysis didn't actually find the effect of severity. So I think that's a really interesting finding. However, I think there is still a really strong argument to be made that, of course, the more complex and the more severe and the more well-established an alcohol problem is, the less likely it is that a controlled drinking outcome would be appropriate or perhaps achievable, even though, we probably just still need more evidence and more kind of specifically designed research trials to try and test out these different roles. There are other measures. There's something called the impaired control scale, which has found to be a bit more effective at kind of predicting the suitability of controlled drinking outcomes. But I suppose, just trying to wrap up, really, from a treatment perspective, it's really important that treatment providers work with what people feel is suitable for them, that they don't try and coerce people to go down specific routes. But at the same time, I think it is important to acknowledge that for many people, and probably most people who enter into treatment, an abstinence-based goal is going to be a better idea, or more suitable, or more achievable for a variety of reasons, not least the boundary is very clear. And I think the other really important thing to say is that there is some good evidence that shows that controlled drinking goals are more possible when following a period of abstinence. And again, there's very little evidence about how long that period of abstinence should be, but you often hear 3 months, for example, as a kind of minimum. But again, I would probably say the more the better. So 8 years of not drinking, I think, undoubtedly helped me, both maybe in terms of the kind of neural kind of synaptic pruning that kind of resets my kind of the kind of neurological aspect of the alcohol dependence that I'd developed, as well as the whole kind of broader set of circumstances, the social, the psychological, and everything else that moved me from a context where, of course, I was going to fail at controlled drinking because I was still in a social network of heavy drinkers and still hadn't addressed any of those issues or practiced it, to a stage in my life 8 years later where kind of the reverse was true. So perhaps I'll kind of wrap up there, but essentially, it's such a complicated issue. We can't say there's ever going to be a one size fits all, but the evidence points to, and certainly my own experience points to, that depending on how you define an alcohol problem, that certainly controlled drinking is possible. But I would strongly say that really does rely on both some very practical aspects, like being very clear about the boundaries and the rules for resuming kind of controlled drinking, as well as, I think, being very clear and honest about what your motives are for alcohol use, and no longer requiring alcohol as a kind of coping mechanism to fill or kind of mask a problem that may have led to dependency or kind of problem drinking in the first place.
I guess that's you for now. Can I just ask, what you went back to drinking? Can I ask what your motive was for returning to drinking after having been not drinking for so long?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think it was a mix of things, but essentially, I mean, I didn't mention, but I did attend Alcoholics Anonymous for a bit in that period of non-drinking, that kind of 8-year period, probably on and off for a couple of years. But I never felt that I was, an alcoholic in the sense that I was, that I needed to never drink again and kind of admit powerlessness over alcohol. I really valued that experience because it was a social network, and I found, being able to talk about my experiences and draw on a support network who really supported me and encouraged me in doing that, whereas most of my peers and friends didn't get or understand, and certainly didn't support my decision to stop drinking for a variety of reasons. But yeah, I never felt that I was just someone who'd never be able to drink again. So that was kind of always buzzing away. I did feel that was the right thing to do, to stop drinking, and I don't regret that at all. But yeah, it was just over time as things began to change, and as I said, my kind of I think my degree of psychological well-being, my finding my way in life a bit more through finding work and sort of career path that I enjoyed, and shifting some of my social networks. I just had more of an instinct that alcohol I didn't want to use alcohol in the way that I used to use it. I just think instinctively on some level I knew that, and therefore to some degree I wanted to experiment with that. Was that instinct true? And I remember a chap called Douglas Cameron, who is retired now, but he worked in alcohol treatment services for a long time, and was highly regarded as a kind of key figure in kind of treatment, and including non-abstinent recovery. And I asked him, do you think I could do it? Could I do controlled drinking? And he just said, well, only you yourself will know whether that's possible. And I really thought about that a lot, and I did really just feel that ultimately it was probably something I could do, but I wanted to kind of test that out.
Would you say, was it curiosity that led you, or was there some sort of positive benefit that you missed, or some social benefit that you missed from doing it?
Both, yeah. So there was a curiosity. I did want to experiment with it. I was aware of all the controversy and debates about controlled drinking. But yeah, I think another important thing to note is that during that period of abstinence, I had also, there was a voice that kind of was saying, oh, you know, you're missing out. Alcohol is fun and enjoyable. And I mean, maybe describing it as a voice sounds a bit like, you know, that's the, you know, a kind of dangerous voice, the voice of addiction trying to lure you back in. But I don't think it was that. I think it was more just kind of a dissonance about the fact that alcohol can be an enjoyable and positive thing for many people. And, you know, I did enjoy drinking in some ways, even though it might have been escapism and destructive. There was still, you know, it's still, you know, maybe on a sort of very biological basis, still kind of works for me. And yeah, I still continue to question why, when I do drink, that how much of it is because if I have a glass of wine, it does have a relaxing effect, a mildly pleasurable effect. And so yeah, I think, and also I'll be honest that I think that I was determined enough to not drink and you know, accept the consequences of, you know, not fitting in amongst other drinking groups. But I do like the idea that I can now, if I want to, you know, join some friends who do drink and have one or two drinks if that's what I feel like. I do like being able to do that. But I think, you know, sometimes I will still not drink, and particularly if I feel like, you know, I'm having a tough time. So I'm very conscious about trying not use alcohol as a kind of coping mechanism. So to alleviate boredom during lockdown, I've made sure that I'm not, you know, drinking more. I'm just sticking to what I, you know, did before lockdown, which, as I said, is pretty much within the guidelines.
Yeah. You mentioned there that you used a little bit of psychotherapy, and you suffered some degree of sort of anxiety and mood issues before, as I think probably most humans on the planet does to some degree. Do you have any sense of to what extent, if at all, that was caused by the drinking, and how much that was sort of you know, as if you could actually do a counterfactually kind of be there without the alcohol?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it was quite a lot of psychotherapy, you know, kind of 6 years of near weekly sessions. And, you know, I'm a huge advocate for it. I just sort of always say, you know, I think all alcohol use and problems and all mental health, however you want to define it, should be seen as a continuum. There's not problem drinkers or people with mental health problems and everybody else. We all lie on a continuum, and we all have ups and downs and so on. Albeit that not everybody drinks. But in terms of the question of alcohol and mental health, I kind of see it more the other way around, that it was, you know, psychological issues that drove destructive drinking rather than the other way around. But undoubtedly, I did experience, you know, more kind of in the moment or shorter term negative effects from the alcohol use. So I used to get kind of, you know, they might be described as anxiety attacks or panic attacks, which I think was the physiological effect of the alcohol. So I'd just have these kind of random sweating fits and very extreme feelings of I was kind of in danger, even though I just wasn't. I was in a lecture, or, you know, more likely just lying in bed hungover or whatever. But that was almost certainly the sort of physiological effect of alcohol disrupting the homeostasis that we know it does. You know, it just throws everything out of sync when alcohol's thrown into the system in large doses. But after I stopped drinking, those kind of anxiety bouts just stopped, you know, very quickly. And then that was when I knew that actually it was alcohol that was responsible for those. But there was still all the underlying stuff, and I still, you know, in some ways it was what we call what Alcoholics Anonymous would describe as white knuckling. You know, you've kicked the drug or the alcohol, but you still have all the issues to work on. Obviously AA suggests doing that through the 12 steps, but, you know, I just kind of see it as I did that through psychotherapy mostly.
I mean, I tackled it, as you know, to some extent through the sort of neuroscientific approach, and there were some. I'll say that after this, I'll ask if anybody's got any questions. So if you get your questions ready, if you stick your hand up. But the neuroscience suggests that there's a kind of renormalization of some dependent brains after 3 months to a year. That basically some of the gremlins that you get as a result of drinking too much will kind of go away. This kind of anxiety and low mood and memory problems, various other things kind of just sort of recede. Now, and you gave up for 8 years, so I think by any paper I've ever read, that were well and truly in the clear as terms of that kind of physiological effect on your brain. So, and to an extent, you're now back to sort of a blank slate, in terms of your response to alcohol. As far as I understand it, you're more or less, there's not much to distinguish you from somebody who's never drunk alcohol at all. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly quite a fan of Mark Lewis's conceptualization of addiction. Mark Lewis is a kind of neuroscientist, stroke former self-identified heroin user or problem user. I think he probably even describes himself as an addict, but or former addict. But yeah, Mark Lewis's kind of critique of the brain disease model of addiction is that that essentially addiction's an form of overlearned behavior, and when you repeat a behavior, synaptic genesis, you learn those pathways, they become reinforced until the behavior just becomes automatic, a bit like learning to drive a car. At start you have very conscious and have to think about it very carefully, but over time you just do it subconsciously. And addiction's a bit like that. What Mark Lewis kind of argues, though, is that in abstinence or whatever, there's synaptic pruning, so those overlearned reward pathways do prune back, they do scale back and kind of may be removed. But he still also argues that post-recovery is a third stage rather than it being a reversion to where it was at the start. The brain is just always developing, and with age and all the other experiences that we go on. So in a broad sense, I'd agree, that period of abstinence did me a lot of good, and without that, maybe I wouldn't have been able to have achieved controlled drinking, even if you could somehow squeeze all the other factors into an immediate change. But yeah, although I'm very focused on the sort of psychological and mental health drivers of addiction or alcohol problems, I certainly don't reject the importance of understanding this kind of brain as a mediator, and the role that neurobiology or whatever maybe can play in helping us understand what happens.
Well, I'll ask one last question. So get ready with your questions and the rest of you. But what research needs to be done? Obviously, I've certainly noticed some gaps. But are there any specific areas that need to be looked at so we can talk about this more clearly?
Well, there's someone called Katie Vitkovits who's based in America who. She's doing some brilliant work around non-abstinent related treatment outcomes, and she in the recent systematic review I mentioned, it defines controlled drinking as drinking within the recommended guidelines, which for a lot of very heavy or very heavily dependent drinkers, that is drinking almost next to nothing. But Katie's showing that she kind of argues that there's lots of other ways to look at this. So rather than measuring recovery by abstinence or how much you drink, it should be based on your kind of other well-being or life outcome measures. So I think that's a really important area to look at. And she's got some studies showing that, people do recover, even if not only they haven't achieved controlled drinking, but they've achieved reduction, even if it involves some binge drinking or what you might call relapses. So I think, what the research that we need to do really is about taking just a much broader approach rather than thinking about, is it just treatment as a goal of either abstinence or controlled drinking, to thinking much more about broader populations, people that don't seek treatment, who recover naturally and might have periods of abstinence versus periods of controlled drinking. And just recognizing the vast complexity and nuance of it all, and just being much less confined by the sort of existing paradigm of alcohol dependence equals treatment and abstinence and lifelong AA attendance. I'm certainly not knocking treatment or AA. They have and will continue to play important roles, but alcohol use and problems is so much broader and more complex than that kind of traditional paradigm.